A wall of fog, a lonely rural road, an armored navy blue Cadillac moving quietly through the night with government plates and dark windows. To anyone paying attention, it looked like a protected vehicle doing exactly what it was supposed to do. But one angry local officer sitting beneath an overpass did not see protection. He saw suspicion, he saw money, he saw black faces inside a vehicle he believed did not belong on his road. And before the night was over, that one mistake would bring federal marshals, state police, internal affairs, and the full weight of the justice system down on a man who thought a badge made him untouchable. Honorable Mariah Ellison sat in the back seat of the Escalade with a leather folder open across her lap and a pair of reading glasses resting low on her nose. She was a federal appeals judge, one of the most respected legal minds in the circuit, and one of the few people in the state who could silence a crowded courtroom without ever raising her voice. Earlier that evening, she had spoken at a civil rights law conference in the city, standing under bright hotel lights before a room filled with attorneys, students, judges, activists, and reporters. Her speech had been about police accountability, constitutional rights, and the quiet danger that grows when public power is not watched closely. She had spoken with grace, but she had not softened the truth. She told them that the Constitution did not live in marble buildings alone. It lived on sidewalks, in traffic stops, in police stations, and in the frightened silence of people who knew the law was supposed to protect them, but had learned not to trust it. Now the applause was gone. The cameras were gone. The polished ballroom and its gold curtains were miles behind her. Outside the Escalade, the night had swallowed the countryside whole. Heavy fog rolled across the road in slow, pale waves, covering the fields and bending around the headlights like smoke. The world beyond the windows looked unfinished, as if the road were being drawn only a few feet at a time. Judge Ellison leaned back against the soft leather seat and let out a slow breath. She was tired in the way only a long day of public duty could make a person tired. Not weak, not distracted, just quiet. Her mind was still full of words from the conference, half-finished thoughts, and the faces of young law students who had come up to shake her hand afterward. In the driver's seat, Agent Caleb Price kept both hands steady on the wheel. He was black, calm, broad-shouldered, and trained to notice everything without looking like he was noticing anything at all. His eyes moved from the road to the mirrors, then back again. He had the kind of controlled stillness that came from years of federal protection work, the kind of stillness that did not advertise itself. Beside him sat Agent Thomas Mercer, a veteran protection officer with gray at his temples and a watchful patience in his eyes. Mercer had worked details for judges, prosecutors, witnesses, and visiting officials. He had seen protesters, threats, angry defendants, and more than one unstable person trying to get close to someone important. But this road bothered him in a quiet way. It was too empty. The fog was too thick. The shoulders were narrow, and the trees pressed close on both sides like they were listening. About 25 minutes out, Agent Price said gently, his voice low enough not to break the quiet. Judge Ellison glanced up from her notes. "Thank you, Agent Price." "No problem, ma'am." Agent Mercer looked out the passenger window. The beam of the Escalade's headlights swept across a cracked sign, a rusted guardrail, and then the dark shape of an overpass ahead. Nothing moved. No houses, no gas stations, no passing trucks, just fog, fields, and the soft hum of the armored vehicle carrying a federal judge home after a speech about the very rights that were about to be tested on that road. Under the overpass, Officer Derek Mallory sat alone in his cruiser, gripping a paper cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. He was a local police officer with 11 years on the force, and a reputation that depended on who was asked. To his friends, he was tough. To his captain, he was useful. To the people who had filed complaints against him, he was a danger with a badge. 3 weeks earlier, he had been called into an office with closed blinds and told that another complaint had landed on the chief's desk. Aggressive stop, racial language, unnecessary force, same pattern, different name. The reprimand had not been serious enough to cost him his job, but it had bruised the one thing Mallory protected more fiercely than anything else, his pride. He had left that meeting smiling, nodding, pretending he understood the concern, but inside, bitterness had sat in him like a stone. He believed the world had gone soft. He believed officers like him were the last wall between order and chaos. Most of all, he believed people were learning to question police too much. They asked for reasons. They recorded stops. They used words like rights and policy and probable cause. Mallory hated those words. To him, they sounded like disrespect dressed up as education. He was thinking about that reprimand when the navy blue Escalade appeared in the fog. At first it was only a pair of headlights, wide and clean, cutting through the mist with expensive certainty. Then the shape came closer, large and polished, moving at a careful speed along the empty road. Mallory sat up, his eyes narrowed. The vehicle was too nice for that stretch of county road at that hour. The windows were too dark. The plates were not the familiar local tags he was used to seeing. There were markings too, official ones, but Mallory did not slow his thoughts long enough to read them properly. His mind had already started building a story. Drug money, fake plates, maybe a stolen vehicle, maybe people coming out of the city thinking they could roll through his county without being checked. The Escalade passed beneath the overpass without speeding, without swerving, without doing anything unusual. Agent Price kept the vehicle centered in the lane, smooth and steady. Inside, Judge Ellison turned a page in her folder and underlined a sentence from her speech. It was a line about how abuse of power rarely announces itself as abuse. Often, it begins as a small decision made by someone certain they will never have to explain it. Behind them, headlights appeared. Agent Mercer noticed first. He looked into the side mirror, then the rearview mirror. The cruiser stayed back for a moment, then eased closer, not rushing, not flashing lights yet, just following. "Unit behind us," Mercer said quietly. Agent Price checked the mirror. "I see him." Judge Ellison looked up. She did not move suddenly. She only folded her glasses and placed them on top of the folder. "Local? Looks like it," Mercer said. The cruiser followed for 1 mile, then 2, then 3. The road curved through low fields and pockets of trees, the fog growing thicker in the hollows. Agent Price kept the speed exact. Not too slow, not too fast. He signaled at every bend where the lane shifted. He did everything by the book, because men in his position learned long ago that following the rules did not always protect them, but it did make the record cleaner when the truth had to be proven later. Mallory's irritation grew with every mile. The SUV did not give him a reason, so he created one. He told himself the driver had touched the lane line. Maybe the plate light was too dim. Maybe the windows were illegal. Maybe the driver seemed nervous. Maybe the whole thing just felt wrong. And to Mallory, that feeling had always been enough. He flicked on his lights. Red and blue exploded through the fog. Inside the Escalade, the cabin filled with the soft pulse of police lights bouncing off glass and leather. Agent Price did not sigh. He did not curse. He activated the turn signal, slowed with care, and guided the heavy vehicle onto the shoulder where the ground looked firm enough to hold its weight. He placed the vehicle in park, turned on the interior lights, lowered his window halfway, and rested both hands high on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Agent Mercer's hand moved near his radio, not dramatic, not rushed, just ready. Judge Ellison sat still in the back, her face calm, her eyes focused on the side mirror where Officer Mallory was stepping out of his cruiser. Mallory approached like a man already offended. His boots scraped against loose gravel. His flashlight was in one hand, angled high. His other hand rested near his gun, not fully gripping it, but close enough to make the message clear. He walked past the rear government plate without really looking at it. He passed the small official marking on the rear glass without care. By the time he reached Agent Price's window, he had already decided what kind of stop this was going to be. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Mallory said. Agent Price kept his voice level. "Good evening, officer. Before I reach for anything, can you tell me the reason for the stop?" Mallory shined the flashlight straight into his face. "I gave you an instruction." "I understand," Price said. "I'm keeping my hands visible. This is a federal protection vehicle. My credentials are in my jacket pocket, and I can provide them slowly if you'd like." Mallory stared at him through the glass. The words federal protection did not calm him. They annoyed him. In his mind, criminals lied. People with something to hide used official-sounding language, and the man behind the wheel was too calm. Mallory wanted nerves. He wanted apology. He wanted the little tremble in a person's voice that told him he was in control. "Federal protection," Mallory repeated, his mouth twisting. "That what we're calling it now?" Agent Mercer leaned slightly toward the open window, keeping both hands visible. "Officer, I'm Agent Thomas Mercer. This vehicle is transporting a protected federal official. We can verify through dispatch, but you need to lower your light and step back from the window." Mallory shifted the flashlight toward Mercer, then back to Price. "I didn't ask you." "Officer," Mercer said, still controlled, "you have stopped a federal protection detail. There are protocols here. We need to keep this calm." Mallory let out a short laugh, with no humor in it. "You boys really rehearsed this, didn't you?" In the back seat, Judge Ellison watched his face, his posture, the way his hand hovered too close to his weapon. She had seen this pattern through hundreds of cases, thousands of pages of testimony, and too many grainy videos played in courtrooms where families sat holding tissues in shaking hands. The stop had started without a reason. The officer had refused to explain himself. The driver had remained calm. The presence of calm had somehow made the officer angrier. It was an old story, unfolding again under fresh fog. Mallory leaned down and finally noticed her in the rear seat. His flashlight cut across her face, her silver earrings, the folder on her lap, the composed expression that did not bend under his glare. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked. Judge Ellison did not flinch. "Officer, my name is Mariah Ellison. I am asking you to listen carefully to the agents in this vehicle." Mallory smiled as if she had amused him. "I didn't ask for a speech from the back seat. You sit there and stay quiet." The air inside the Escalade changed. Agent Price's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mercer's eyes hardened, but neither man moved in a way that would give Mallory an excuse. Judge Ellison remained still. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried the kind of authority that did not need volume. "You have not given a legal reason for this stop," she said. "The driver is complying. The agents have identified the nature of this vehicle. Your behavior is turning a non-threatening situation into something dangerous." Mallory's face flushed. It was not the words alone. It was the calmness of them. It was the fact that this black woman in the back seat spoke to him as if the law were larger than his mood. He stepped back, pulled the driver's door open before Agent Price could be instructed to move, and raised his voice. "Out of the vehicle." Agent Price did not move. "Officer, I am part of a federal protection detail. I am armed in my official capacity. For everyone's safety, we need to coordinate this properly." Mallory's hand closed around his gun. "I said out." Agent Mercer's voice sharpened. "Do not draw that weapon." But Mallory had already crossed the line in his own mind. The gun came out, dark and steady enough to be terrifying, though the man holding it was anything but steady. He pointed it toward Agent Price, toward the open window, toward the protected vehicle, toward a moment he did not understand and could not take back. Judge Ellison reached slowly for the secure phone beside her. Mercer's hand moved to his radio. "Federal distress," Mercer said into the mic, his voice clear. "Protected judicial official unlawfully detained by local law enforcement. Officer has drawn a weapon on federal protection detail. Rural Route 46, near the East Overpass. Immediate assistance required." Mallory heard the words, and panic flashed behind his eyes. For 1 second, the fog, the lights, the gun, and the quiet faces inside the SUV seemed to press in around him, but pride still held him upright. Pride made him tighten his grip. Pride made him aim at a man who had done nothing but follow every rule. In the back seat, Judge Ellison's call connected. "This is Judge Mariah Ellison," she said, calm as stone while red and blue lights washed over her face. "I need the State Attorney General on the line now." "This is Judge Mariah Ellison," she said, calm as stone while red and blue lights washed over her face. "I need the State Attorney General on the line now." For one strange second, the whole road seemed to hold its breath. The fog drifted slowly over the hood of the Escalade. The cruiser lights kept flashing, red, blue, painting the trees and the wet gravel in restless color. Officer Derek Mallory stood outside the open driver's door, with his gun pointed toward Agent Caleb Price, and even through all his anger, he could feel something slipping out of his hands. He had stopped a vehicle because he wanted control. He had drawn his weapon because he wanted obedience. But now there were voices on radios, a federal distress code in the air, and a woman in the back seat speaking into a secure phone with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly who would answer. Agent Mercer kept his eyes fixed on Mallory. His own voice had gone low and firm, the way trained men speak when a mistake can turn deadly. "Officer Mallory, lower your weapon. Do it slowly. Nobody inside this vehicle is threatening you." Mallory's breathing was loud. His chest rose and fell under his vest. The gun in his hand did not shake much, but his face gave him away. He had heard the words "protected judicial official." He had heard Judge Ellison say her own name. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that name. Maybe from a news segment. Maybe from a case his captain once complained about. Maybe from one of those legal training emails he never read but always deleted. But pride has a way of making a man deaf. It tells him that backing down is death. It tells him that the only way to survive a bad choice is to make a louder one. "I said nobody moves," Mallory barked, but the command no longer sounded powerful. It sounded thin, like a door rattling in the wind. Agent Price sat perfectly still, both hands open, both hands visible. His eyes were on Mallory's trigger finger, not his face, not the badge, the finger. He had been trained to read tiny movements, pressure changes, muscle twitches, the invisible line between threat and tragedy. His voice stayed steady. "Officer, listen to me. You do not want to fire that weapon. You are pointing a gun at a federal agent assigned to protect a sitting federal appeals judge. You can still lower it. You can still make the next choice better than the last one." From the back seat, Judge Ellison listened as the Attorney General's senior aide came on the secure line, breathless and confused at first, then suddenly silent as she explained what was happening. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She gave the location, the officer's name from his badge, the cruiser number, the fact that he had refused to explain the stop, the fact that he had ignored federal identification, and the fact that he had drawn a weapon on her protection detail. Every word was clean. Every word was measured. She spoke like a woman creating a record that no one would be able to bury. Mallory took a step back from the door, still holding the gun. "Hang up that phone," he snapped at her. "I'm not playing games with you." Judge Ellison looked at him through the open space between the front seats. Her face was tired, but her eyes were awake in a way that made Mallory feel smaller than he wanted to feel. "Officer Mallory," she said, "the game ended the moment you drew your weapon." That was when Agent Mercer moved. He did not leap. He did not shout. He opened the passenger door with controlled speed, stepped out behind it, and drew his own weapon in one smooth motion. His stance was clean, trained, and terrifyingly steady. The barrel pointed at Mallory's center mass. "Drop the gun," Mercer ordered. "Drop it now." Mallory swung toward him, panic burning across his face. "Don't you point that at me. I'm police." "You are an armed threat to a federal protective detail," Mercer said. "Drop the weapon." Inside the Escalade, Agent Price shifted just enough to angle his body between Mallory and the judge. He did not draw yet, because the wrong movement could light the whole road on fire. He kept his voice low. "Derek, listen to him. Put it down. Right now." The use of his first name struck Mallory harder than it should have. It made the scene feel less like a stop and more like a judgment. He looked at Mercer. He looked at Price. He looked toward the back seat, where Judge Ellison still held the phone. Then, far away through the fog, another sound reached them. Sirens. Not one, several, fast and getting closer. Mallory's gun lowered an inch. "On the ground," Mercer said, slowly. Mallory swallowed. His face was pale now, slick with sweat despite the cool night air. The weapon dipped again. His fingers loosened. The gun hung at his side, then fell from his hand onto the gravel with a dull, final sound. "Step away from it," Mercer ordered. Mallory stepped back. "Hands where I can see them." For the first time that night, Officer Derek Mallory obeyed a command. He raised his hands. Agent Price came out of the vehicle now, moving with careful purpose. He kept himself between Mallory and Judge Ellison's door, while Mercer secured the fallen weapon with his foot and kicked it away. Mallory's lips moved like he was trying to find the right words, the magic words that would turn the whole thing back into a routine stop. But there were no magic words left. Only fog, cameras, witnesses, and the sound of approaching sirens growing louder by the second. The first state police cruiser appeared through the mist, like a shape coming out of a dream. Then a second. Then two black federal vehicles with lights hidden behind their grills. They came in hard but controlled, boxing in Mallory's cruiser from the front and rear. Doors flew open. State troopers moved to the shoulders. Federal marshals moved toward the Escalade. Every weapon, every flashlight, every set of eyes turned toward Mallory. "Hands up!" one marshal shouted. "They're up!" Mallory yelled, his voice cracking. "They're up! I'm an officer! I'm local police." A senior marshal stepped close, grabbed Mallory's wrists, and pulled them behind his back. The handcuffs clicked shut before Mallory could finish saying his own name. That sound, so familiar to him, so often used by him, seemed to empty the last bit of arrogance from his body. He stared down at the gravel as if he had never seen a road before. Judge Ellison finally stepped out of the Escalade. Agent Price opened the rear door for her and stood close, scanning the tree line out of habit. Agent Mercer remained near Mallory, his face hard and unreadable. The judge's coat moved softly in the night wind. She looked small beside the armored vehicle and the flashing lights, but no one on that road mistook her for powerless now. The state police commander approached her with clear worry on his face. "Your Honor, are you hurt?" "No," she said, but this came close enough. Mallory lifted his head. He saw her fully for the first time, not as a shadow in the back seat, not as a woman he could silence with a flashlight and a tone. He saw the federal judge whose opinions had shaped law across the circuit. He saw the woman from the conference, the one whose speech had been carried by the local news that very evening, and slowly, with awful clarity, he understood that he had not just made a bad stop. He had aimed a gun at the machinery of federal justice and dared it to answer. He began talking at once. They were driving suspicious. The vehicle drifted. The driver wouldn't comply. He reached for something. I had no idea who they were. They were acting strange. Agent Price turned his head slightly, not angry, almost sad. "Officer, the vehicle records everything." Mallory stopped. The senior marshal looked toward the Escalade. "Everything? Speed, braking, lane position, exterior audio, interior audio, forward and rear video," Agent Mercer said. "Full security package." A state police technician was already at the vehicle, connecting a secure device to the onboard system. Within minutes, the truth began to play on a screen inside one of the federal SUVs. There was the Escalade holding the lane. There was the speed, steady and legal. There was Mallory following for miles. There was his failure to state a real reason for the stop. There was Agent Price identifying the detail. There was Agent Mercer warning him. There was Mallory's voice, sharp and ugly, telling Judge Ellison to stay quiet. There was the moment his gun came out. And then there were the remarks. Not all of them had been shouted. Some had been muttered under his breath as he approached. Some were low comments to himself in the cruiser before he stepped out, but the microphones caught them. The assumptions, the contempt. The poison that had been there before he ever saw a license, before he ever asked a question, before he ever learned a name. The Internal Affairs Commander arrived 40 minutes later, hair uncombed, coat thrown over a shirt that had clearly been buttoned in a hurry. His name was Commander Louis Grant, and he had the face of a man who knew the difference between a bad night and the start of a public disaster. He watched the footage once, then he watched it again. By the end, his jaw was tight. He turned to Mallory, who was standing cuffed beside a cruiser, guarded by 2 troopers. "You fabricated the stop." Mallory shook his head. "No, sir. You ignored federal identification. I didn't believe them. You drew your weapon without cause. They were suspicious." Grant's voice went colder. "You pointed a gun at a federal protection agent while a federal appeals judge was seated in the vehicle." Mallory had no answer for that. Judge Ellison walked toward him slowly. The road was quieter now. The first rush of movement had settled into something heavier. Paperwork would come later. Charges would come later. But this moment belonged to the truth, and everyone there seemed to feel it. Mallory would not look at her at first. "Officer Mallory," she said. His eyes lifted. "The law is not your personal weapon," she said. "It does not become larger because you are angry. It does not become smaller because the person in front of you is black, and a badge does not give you permission to create fear and then call that fear evidence." Mallory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "You did not misunderstand this situation," she continued. "You built it. You followed a vehicle that gave you no lawful reason. You ignored what you did not want to see. You heard identification and chose disbelief. You saw calm and treated it as guilt. That is not policing. That is abuse." Her words were not loud. They did not need to be. The fog carried them. The officers heard them. The marshals heard them. Agent Price heard them with his hands folded in front of him, his face unreadable except for the smallest flicker of pain behind his eyes, because he knew, perhaps more deeply than anyone standing there, how close the night had come to ending another way. Mallory was placed in the back of a state police vehicle, not his own cruiser. His badge and gun were taken at the scene. His body camera, dash camera, radio logs and phone were seized. By dawn, the first charges were being prepared. Aggravated assault, official misconduct, reckless endangerment, violation of civil rights under color of law. By breakfast, his name was no longer protected by the quiet walls of his department. By noon, the department's own silence began to turn against it. What started on a foggy road did not stay on that road. Federal investigators arrived with questions that were too specific to dodge. They asked about old complaints. They asked about missing reports. They asked why certain traffic stop records had been edited after citizens filed grievances. They asked why body camera files had vanished from the archive. They asked why Officer Mallory, with his long history of aggressive stops and racial complaints, had been left alone on rural patrol after being reprimanded. The answers came slowly at first. Then, under pressure, they came faster. A clerk admitted she had been told to reclassify complaints as customer service concerns. A former sergeant admitted supervisors had warned officers not to write too much in reports when Mallory was involved. A patrolman admitted that certain stops were known inside the department as Mallory specials, the kind where the reason came after the arrest. Then a young records technician, frightened and tired of lying, gave federal agents access to a backup folder no one at the top thought still existed. That folder changed everything. Inside were altered reports, deleted video logs, internal emails, and notes from command staff meetings where supervisors discussed how to keep complaints from becoming lawsuits. Mallory was no longer the whole story. He was only the most visible symptom. Behind him stood a department that had learned to treat misconduct like spilled coffee. Wipe it up quickly, keep people moving, pretend the stain was never there. The raid came 2 weeks later, just after sunrise. Federal agents entered the department with warrants. State police stood outside. Computers were removed. File cabinets were emptied. The captain who had protected Mallory for years was told to surrender his phone and badge. 2 supervisors were suspended before lunch. By evening, the local news was no longer talking only about the judge in the Escalade. They were talking about years of racial profiling, falsified traffic stops, buried complaints, and a culture that had allowed one officer's prejudice to become department practice. Judge Ellison did not speak to the press during those early days. She returned to work. She heard cases. She wrote opinions. She sat on the bench with the same composed dignity she had carried on that roadside. But those who knew her could see the weight of it, not fear exactly. Something deeper, a sorrow sharpened into purpose. Agent Price remained on her detail. Agent Mercer did too. They never made the story about themselves, even though both men had stood inches from disaster. Price, especially, became a quiet symbol in the investigation. The records showed he had done everything right. He had pulled over safely. He had shown his hands. He had spoken calmly. He had identified himself. And still, a gun had been pointed at him. That fact sat at the center of the case, like a stone no one could move. Months passed. Fog gave way to winter rain, then to spring light. Mallory's case moved through federal court with the slow, heavy certainty of a door closing. The man who had once strutted up to car windows with his hand near his gun now entered the courthouse in a plain suit that did not fit him well. His shoulders were rounded. His eyes stayed low. His badge was gone. His union had stepped back. His department had abandoned him because protecting him now meant drowning with him. The evidence was too clear. The recordings were too complete. The lies were too many. On the morning he pleaded guilty, the courtroom was full. There were reporters in the back rows, civil rights attorneys along the side, federal officers near the doors, and former victims of Mallory's stops sitting quietly together. Some had never been believed before. Some had lost jobs fighting charges that should never have existed. Some had paid fines just to make the trouble stop. They watched Mallory stand before the judge and admit, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had violated the law he swore to uphold. At sentencing, Judge Mariah Ellison did not sit on the bench. She stood at a lectern as a victim of the crime, wearing a dark suit and the same calm expression she had worn on the roadside. For a moment, she looked at Mallory. Then she looked at the court. "The most frightening part of that night," she said, "is not that it happened to me. It is that I survived the encounter partly because of a title, because there were agents in the vehicle, because the vehicle recorded everything, because when I made a phone call, powerful people answered." The courtroom was silent. If Agent Price had been alone, she continued, if he had been an ordinary black man driving home after work, the story might have been written by the person who pointed the gun. If there had been no protected detail, no federal plates, no security system, no immediate response, we might be here speaking about a tragedy instead of a prosecution. Agent Price sat in the front row, his eyes fixed ahead. Judge Ellison's voice remained steady, but there was a soft ache beneath it now. Racism becomes especially dangerous when it is given a badge, a gun, and a system willing to look away. A single officer can do harm, but a department that hides that harm teaches him he has permission. That is why accountability matters, not because it is revenge, because it is the only way the next person gets to make it home. Mallory did not look up. The federal judge assigned to the case listened carefully. When the sentence came, it was long enough to make the courtroom exhale, long enough that Mallory's knees nearly gave out when he heard it. He was taken away in handcuffs, not by enemies, not by people seeking payback, but by the same system of law he had once claimed to represent. The consequences did not end with him. The department entered a federal consent decree. New policies were forced into place. Traffic stop data had to be tracked and reviewed. Body camera footage could no longer disappear into quiet folders. Supervisors were required to answer for patterns, not just individual complaints. Training was rewritten. Officers were removed. Lawsuits followed. For the first time in years, people who had been told they were exaggerating began to see official records prove they had been telling the truth all along. On the day the consent decree was announced, Judge Ellison walked down the courthouse steps, with Agent Price on one side and Agent Mercer on the other. The afternoon sun was soft, bright, and clean, nothing like the fog from that night on the rural road. Reporters called her name. Cameras clicked. She did not stop for long. She only paused near the bottom step and looked toward the street, where ordinary cars passed through ordinary traffic, each one carrying a life no officer had the right to endanger without cause. Agent Mercer opened the rear door of the Escalade. Agent Price stood beside it, watchful as always. Judge Ellison looked at both men and gave a small nod. It was not dramatic. It was not meant for the cameras. It was the quiet respect of three people who understood how close the darkness had come and how hard the truth had fought its way into the light. Across town, Derek Mallory was being processed into federal custody, his hands chained at his waist, his steps slow, his name stripped of every title that had once made him feel powerful. He had believed the road belonged to him. He had believed fear was the same thing as authority. He had believed a badge could turn prejudice into law. But the law had answered back. And in the end, the man who thought no one could question him learned the lesson he had spent his career refusing to understand. Power is not ownership. A badge is not a crown. And no one, no matter how loud, how armed, or how protected by silence, stands above the Constitution.